Hi, I'm Lucy from Sew Essential and I'm here today to share my 5 most popular sewing tips from 2023. I'm going to show you an awesome hack for pattern matching. I'm going to show you how to join elastic without overlapping it so there's no bulk. How to sew a buttonhole bigger than your one-step buttonhole will allow, how to join bias binding in a super neat way, and how to repair a corner when you accidentally snip through those stitches. Don't forget to sign up for our newsletter. I'm going to pop the link below because every week we send you more sewing tips like these and lots more sewing inspiration too. We use elastic all the time in sewing projects and very often we have to join it, but we have to overlap it, and because elastic's quite thick and bulky it can just add unwanted bulk to your sewing project. With this next hack I'm going to show you how you can create a super smooth join with no overlapping and no bulk. Normally when you join elastic you would overlap it and create that nasty bulk, but we're going to use a scrap of fabric to avoid that by placing the elastic on top of the fabric and butting the ends up like so. So you can see I've put the ends together there in that piece of fabric. I'm just going to move that across so it's more central actually. And then I'm going to fold the fabric over the top. And fold it up over the bottom as well, and then I'm going to pin that in place, and I just want to make sure that the pins are, using longer pins is better for this, but I'm just using fairly standard size pins here, but just make sure that on this side the pins you've got room for manoeuvre with your sewing machine foot. So I'm just pulling them out so that they're only just poking out there and they're longer on this side, and that will enable me now to stitch that fabric down. Not worrying about neatness here because this is going to go inside a garment usually, and I'm on camera, but if you want to take your time and make it super neat you can, but I'm just going to go ahead now and stitch everything in place. I'm going to sew over pins, which I wouldn't recommend. You can break a needle doing this, but just for the purposes of the video, do as I say, not as I do, as they say. So off we go. Let's stitch everything down in place now. So as I say, not the neatest stitching I've ever done, but that fabric is now secured and there's no bulk. It's lovely and smooth and flat. If you're working on something super special or you've got a fabric that's got a really obvious print, matching the pattern can elevate your garment to the next level and make it look super professional, but it can be really complicated and tricky trying to work out seam allowances and how to do it. With this next tip, I'll show you a really easy way to match that pattern so that it flows perfectly across the seams and you barely notice that they're there. This is an awesome pattern matching tip that I absolutely loved when I saw it. So the first thing you do is cut out your first pattern piece and press under the seam allowance. And on the pattern piece, also mark the seam allowance so that you're able to fold that under on the pattern piece too. So here we have the fabric that we're going to cut the second pattern piece out of, and what you need to do is take the pattern piece that you've already cut out and then just match that up with the print on the fabric on the table that you're going to cut. So just make sure everything lines up and matches up, and that print continues from your cut piece onto the piece that you're going to cut. So everything's lining up. And you know, this is a really busy fabric, and you might be watching this thinking, well, I wouldn't bother with that, I wouldn't bother pattern matching that anyway. But you can still use the principle of this on checks or whatever you're working with, you know, something that's got a really big exaggerated print. You can still use these same principles. So you can see I'm getting even like the branches of that plant to line up nicely. All the pattern is continuing over onto the uncut fabric piece. And then what I need to do is take that folded edge, so I've folded under the seam allowance of the pattern piece, and I'm going to take that folded edge and line that up with the folded edge of the cut piece on the fabric, and then pin that in place, making sure everything stays in place and lines up nicely. And you'd use more pins than this, I'm just showing you quickly for the video, but you'd use more of the pins than that if you wanted to really secure things. And then you can move that cut piece out of the way, press down that seam allowance that you'd folded under, and then you can pin that in place. And then you'd pin the rest of your pattern piece in the normal way and cut that out all the way around the edge in the usual way. And then this is what you'll end up with. You'll have your original piece with the seam allowance folded under, and you'll have your second piece that you've cut out to match up. So then you would just pin those two pieces together in the usual way. You could unpress the seam allowance if you wanted to, but you can just pin that in place to secure it. So I'm just going to do that now. Just pin along that seam allowance, that's along that seam line rather. And then you sew that seam line in place, but I'll just show you now just with it pinned in place. If I open that out now, you'll see that beautiful pattern matching. So you'll see that that pattern continues perfectly from one side to the other. You can see even that branch there is joining up beautifully. The petals are all continuing, so that pattern just runs so beautifully, and you'd barely notice the seam once that was sewn and pressed. Have you ever wanted to create a super-sized buttonhole? You might be bag making and want to thread a strap through it, or you might have made a wrap skirt and want to thread a tie through it, or you might just want to use a statement button on a jacket or a coat or a home deck project, but your one-step buttonhole foot just won't sew a buttonhole big enough. With this next tip, you can sew a buttonhole any size you like. This is a great tip for buttonholes that will help you to overcome a perceived limitation of your sewing machine. So most modern sewing machines will come with a one-step buttonhole foot, which enables you to sew a buttonhole in one simple step. It measures the buttonhole for you. However, there are limitations to this, and usually it will only allow you to sew a buttonhole that's 1 inch big. Now, there might be occasions when actually you want to sew a bigger buttonhole than that. You might want to create some really neat belt loops to thread a belt through. You might want to use a really big statement button on a coat or a jacket or a home deck project perhaps, and you might want to sew a buttonhole bigger than 1 inch. But actually there is a workaround for that. Instead of using the one-step buttonhole foot, use the satin stitch foot on your machine, select the relevant buttonhole stitch, and then engage this black lever. This is the Janome 5060 QDC, but there'll be something similar on your machine. And this normally works in conjunction with the one-step buttonhole foot, And when the one-step buttonhole foot gets to a certain point, it taps that lever and tells it to sew the next step of the buttonhole. But instead of doing that, you're going to tap it with your finger. So I'll show you how this works. I won't necessarily sew an enormous buttonhole because we're on a video, and but I'll just show you how you can manually make this work. So I've selected the relevant buttonhole stitch. I'm just going to sew the first row of stitches now. And when I get to the point that I want to start sewing the buttonhole, and that's as long as I want the buttonhole to be, I'd mark the buttonhole on my fabric normally. I'm just going to tap the black lever, and then that will continue down and sew the next step. And then I'm going to tap the black lever again, sew the bar tack. And then just before I get to the end of the first row of stitches, I'm going to tap the lever again to sew the next bar tack. And then I did say I was sewing the initial bar tack earlier. I didn't sew that, it just sewed the next row of stitches. So I'm going to do the final bar tack now, just hit that button one last time, that lever. And there we have it, a lovely, neat buttonhole that I can make any size I like. This next hack's going to show you how to join the ends of bias binding so that everything matches up beautifully and it looks super neat. This is a nice, neat way to join bias binding. So you obviously have to join two ends of the bias binding when you're attaching it to armholes or necklines or whatever sewing project you're doing. And just getting that to be nice and neat can be quite tricky. So you can see here I've got my first end of bias binding stitched down. I'm just using a scrap of fabric here, but you can imagine this is a garment or something. But I've got that stitched down along the fold in the normal way, and then I've got some excess binding here left over. And then I've pinned the other end of the binding to the fabric, and where the stitching stops on that initial piece of binding, that's where I want to stop stitching when I stitch this in place. And again, I've got some excess binding fabric left over there. So I'm just going to stitch that down now. Okay, so you can see there I've stitched that in place to where the join with the other piece of binding is, where the other piece of binding the stitching line ends. Now I'm going to open that binding, one of the pieces of binding out like so. So open out the fold, and then the other piece of binding I'm also going to open out on top of it, so that the right sides of the binding are together. So everything's opened out and the right sides are together. So you can see the fabric is sort of folded over here. And then we're going to stitch from the edge of the binding down to the stitching line below. And then when we open that out, you can see we've got a lovely neat join there. I'm just going to snip that excess fabric, binding fabric off now, so I can just snip that excess off near the stitching line. Just being careful not to snip the fabric by accident, but just snip that excess off, and then you can give that a press and everything lines up beautifully and it looks lovely and neat. You've just sewn a beautiful collar or waistband corner, everything's going great, and then you snip through those stitches. We've all been there, it's a horrible feeling, but this next tip is going to show you a quick fix to remedy that problem. This is a really simple tip, and but it's one that I think we've probably all come across this problem in our time. So we've sewn a lovely neat corner on a collar or a waistband perhaps. You've gone to snip the corner and you've accidentally snipped through those stitches. Oh, it's so awful. It's such an awful feeling, and we've all been there. Even the most experienced sewists will tell you that they've done this. Now, you've got the choice to either remake that part, which you might be happy to do. You might be a real perfectionist and want absolutely perfect results, in which case that might be what you do. But what I sometimes do to fix this problem is I just sew over the original sewing line and then just taper in to create a new corner where the old one was. Obviously it's not going to be exactly the same as the other side, so if you are a perfectionist you might not like this idea, but I've used it plenty of times and it's worked for me and I've been happy with the results. So I'm just going to show you that now. I'm just going to start by stitching over that original stitching line. And then I'm just starting to taper in ever so slightly as we head to the corner. And then I can turn and taper again back to the stitching line on the other side. And there you have a new corner. So it's not going to be perfect, it's not going to be exactly the same as the other side. If you could get a better visibility as well, I'm sort of sitting back so my head's not in the way of the camera, but if you can get right by the needle, you could probably taper that in even closer to make the corner even closer to the original. But that's just a way that can just save you sanity and a lot of time and effort sometimes. So I hope you've enjoyed all those wonderful tips. I know I enjoyed making the video. Don't forget to sign up for our newsletter, because every week you'll get tips like those, plus lots of sewing inspiration and ideas too. If you like what you see today, please like and subscribe, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.